Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Mr. Midnight Lullabies. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, but before you drift off, I'd like for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you are listening from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's cases. Story 1. In the heart of New York City, amidst the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, a chilling series of events unfolded behind the closed doors of a luxury apartment near the Empire State Building. Ryan Hemphill, a 43-year-old private equity executive and attorney, led a life that many would envy. Educated at prestigious institutions and employed in high-profile roles, he appeared to be the epitome of success. However, beneath this polished exterior lurked a man whose actions would soon shock the city and the nation. Between October 2024 and March 2025, Hemphill allegedly used online platforms such as Seeking Arrangements, Craigslist, and FetLife to meet women, offering them monetary compensation for companionship. Once they entered his Midtown Manhattan apartment, prosecutors claim, they were subjected to hours of physical and sexual violence. Victims reported being drugged, restrained, and assaulted, with Hemphill allegedly using devices like cattle prods and shock collars to inflict pain. Some women were coerced into signing false statements or withdrawing complaints under duress. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office charged Hemphill with 116 counts, including rape, predatory sexual assault, and witness bribery. Investigators uncovered weapons, drugs, and surveillance footage in his apartment, suggesting that the 6 women identified might only represent a fraction of his alleged victims. Hemphill has pleaded not guilty to all charges and is currently held without bail at Rikers Island. This case raises profound questions about power, manipulation, and the vulnerability of individuals seeking connection in the digital age. As the legal proceedings unfold, the full extent of Hemphill's alleged crimes remains to be seen, but the impact on his victims is undeniable. Ryan Hemphill, a man who appeared to have it all, was not always the subject of criminal scrutiny. To the outside world, he was a respected financial advisor, well-educated, well-spoken, and seemingly successful. He held prestigious degrees from Ivy League universities, working his way through the corporate world with an apparent ease that few could rival. Hemphill had a job that many aspired to, executive roles in private equity and law firms, working with high-end clients in Manhattan's elite financial circles. By all accounts, he was the model of a successful businessman. Yet, these external achievements served as a carefully crafted disguise for what lay beneath. Born and raised in a middle-class family, Hemphill was the son of 2 hard-working parents who placed high value on education. He excelled academically, graduated from some of the best schools, and was seemingly destined for success. But in his rise to the top, his social circles began to look more like a stage for manipulation. Hemphill wasn't just climbing the corporate ladder, he was learning to manipulate people, to play on their desires, and exploit vulnerabilities. For much of his career, he kept a low profile, working in high-stakes investment and law jobs. However, Hemphill was not only seeking power in boardrooms and financial meetings. Behind the facade of his professional life, he began to develop another persona, one that he used to lure women into his orbit. Hemphill, like many men in positions of wealth and influence, was an active participant on several online platforms designed to connect wealthy individuals with those seeking financial support or companionship. Among the platforms he frequented were Seeking Arrangements, Craigslist, and FetLife. These sites are known for facilitating interactions between wealthy men and women, sometimes referred to as sugar daddies and sugar babies, with arrangements that often include gifts, allowances, and promises of mentorship. Hemphill, however, wasn't looking for a simple transactional relationship. He wasn't interested in genuine companionship, he sought control and dominance over his victims, a power dynamic that would soon come to light. Through these online platforms, Hemphill presented himself as a wealthy businessman who could offer women financial support, luxurious experiences, and an escape from their everyday lives. His persona online was carefully constructed to appear irresistible. He depicted himself as generous, refined, and successful, a man who could make the lives of young women in need of financial assistance or excitement better. In many ways, Hemphill exploited the vulnerability of the women he encountered. Many were struggling financially, seeking help in exchange for companionship, unaware that their willingness to trust a seemingly respectable man would ultimately lead them down a horrific path. The allure of easy money clouded their judgment, and they often found themselves in his grasp before they even realized it. But it wasn't long before Hemphill's true nature became evident. Once women agreed to meet him in person, they were greeted by a vastly different reality. His apartment in Midtown Manhattan, which he had carefully chosen for its proximity to his high-powered financial career, was more than just a place of residence. It was, prosecutors argue, a carefully crafted trap, a space where Hemphill would exercise complete control over his victims. The women, lured into the apartment with promises of financial help and exciting experiences, quickly discovered they had fallen into a nightmare. Victims reported being drugged, restrained, and assaulted in ways too horrific to describe. Hemphill allegedly used tools such as cattle prods and shock collars, devices meant for animals, to inflict pain, further asserting his power over them. Some were even forced to relive their past traumas, manipulated into signing false statements to withdraw complaints or silence them. The abuse was systematic and methodical. Victims were isolated, their freedom stripped away. Investigators later uncovered disturbing evidence inside Hemphill's apartment, a wealth of drugs, weapons, and surveillance footage documenting the abuse. It was clear that this was not an isolated incident, but rather the manifestation of a dark pattern of behavior, one that spanned several months and involved numerous women. Hemphill's ability to manipulate and coerce his victims into compliance demonstrated just how carefully he had planned his actions, and how far he was willing to go to maintain control over his victims. Hemphill's charm and smooth demeanor allowed him to gain the trust of these women, and when they entered his apartment, they were trapped. Once inside, they were subjected to unimaginable horrors, torture, physical violence, and threats that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. According to prosecutors, he manipulated not just their bodies, but their minds, making them feel powerless and helpless. Hemphill's confidence and ability to control the situation was chilling. He knew exactly what to say, exactly what to do, to ensure his victims wouldn't escape. As the investigation into his actions continued, it became clear that the case against Hemphill was not just about one man's abuse of power. It was about the exploitation of women in vulnerable situations, women who were looking for a way out of difficult circumstances. It also became a conversation about the dangers of online platforms, where people can hide behind false identities and manipulate others without ever facing the consequences. Hemphill had used these platforms as a hunting ground, and the women who sought out financial help were his prey. This case was more than just about a financial advisor who used women as tools for his own twisted pleasure. It was about the dangers of trusting strangers online, and the horrific ways that trust can be exploited. Hemphill, a man with everything to lose, chose instead to use his wealth and charm to destroy the lives of those who came into his path. It was between October 2024 and March 2025 that Ryan Hemphill's horrific crimes would come to light. Up until then, he had carefully constructed his life, a life that many believed was the epitome of success. On the outside, he was a respectable man, living in a luxury Manhattan apartment, holding high-ranking positions in private equity and law. But what happened behind the walls of his pristine apartment tells a far different story, one of manipulation, brutality, and a calculated pattern of abuse. Hemphill used online platforms like Seeking Arrangements, Craigslist, and FetLife to target vulnerable women. These websites, known for connecting wealthy men with women looking for financial support or relationships, would become the gateway for Hemphill's dark predatory behavior. The women he met online were often struggling financially, some dealing with personal crises, others seeking the comfort of an easy lifestyle. To them, Hemphill presented himself as a solution, someone who could offer them financial security in exchange for their companionship. What they didn't know, however, was that the moment they agreed to meet him in person, they were stepping into a nightmare. Each meeting began in the same way. Hemphill would reach out to the women, promising them extravagant gifts, allowances, or an escape from their daily lives. He portrayed himself as a man of means, an individual who could offer them a life of luxury and excitement. Once the women agreed to meet him, he would invite them to his midtown Manhattan apartment, where he assured them they would be treated well, and their needs would be met. What awaited them behind the doors of Hemphill's apartment, however, was not the lifestyle of wealth and comfort he had promised. The apartment, though luxurious and well-appointed, was the setting for something far darker. As soon as the women entered, they were often drugged, rendering them vulnerable and disoriented. Prosecutors alleged that once the drugs took effect, Hemphill would begin his cruel manipulation. The women, now under his control, had no escape. According to the victims' testimonies, Hemphill's behavior was calculated and methodical. He allegedly used tools such as cattle prods and shock collars, devices designed for livestock, as instruments of pain and control. These were not just tools of intimidation, they were used with terrifying precision to cause suffering, to bend his victims to his will. The shock collars, often used for training dogs, were attached to the women's necks, sending jolts of electricity through their bodies when Hemphill saw fit. The cattle prods, typically used to move large animals, were used to inflict pain on a scale unimaginable for those unfamiliar with the brutality of his methods. But Hemphill's cruelty did not stop at physical pain. Prosecutors alleged that he also psychologically tortured his victims. They were forced to relive past traumas, made to feel utterly helpless, and were isolated from the world. Some women were allegedly manipulated into signing false statements to retract their complaints or keep quiet about the abuse. This level of coercion and control left the victims in a state of fear, unable to speak out, trapped in a cycle of violence. As the abuse continued, Hemphill's hold over his victims grew stronger. He used his knowledge of law and financial power to manipulate the women, making them believe they had no other option but to comply. In some cases, victims were coerced into performing acts they would later regret, but by that time, they had already been manipulated into staying silent. Hemphill was not just exploiting their bodies, he was destroying their trust, their sense of self-worth, and their ability to fight back. Some women managed to escape his grasp, but even then, Hemphill's control was not easily shaken. One victim, after escaping, reportedly contacted the authorities, helping to bring the crimes to light. It was through her bravery that the police were able to piece together the horrific reality of what had occurred inside Hemphill's apartment. What followed was an intense investigation that would uncover even more disturbing details. When police raided Hemphill's apartment, they found a wealth of evidence that painted a chilling picture of his actions. Inside, authorities discovered an array of drugs, substances that were allegedly used to incapacitate his victims, making them easier to control. They also found weapons, restraints, and various devices that had been used to restrain and torture the women. Perhaps most damning of all, however, were the surveillance videos, footage that reportedly showed Hemphill engaging in the abuse, further implicating him in the crimes. These videos, which allegedly documented multiple incidents, would become key pieces of evidence in the case against him. In addition to the physical evidence, investigators found documents that indicated Hemphill had been in contact with several women. Women who had been subjected to similar abuse. Authorities were now faced with the disturbing realization that the 6 women who had come forward might only be a small fraction of Hemphill's victims. The true scale of his actions had yet to be fully understood, and more women were likely to be discovered as the investigation continued. As prosecutors began to piece together the full scope of Hemphill's alleged crimes, the impact on the victims became clearer. These women had been violated in ways that went beyond the physical. Many had been manipulated into believing that they had no escape, no choice but to comply. Hemphill's actions were not random, they were part of a calculated plan to control, humiliate, and break down his victims, leaving them isolated and fearful. In court, the testimony of the victims would become the backbone of the prosecution's case. Each woman who came forward revealed the terrifying details of what had occurred in Hemphill's apartment. From drugging to torture, from psychological manipulation to threats of violence, their stories painted a grim picture of a man who had carefully constructed a life built on deception and cruelty. Hemphill's manipulation wasn't just about getting what he wanted in the moment, It was about breaking these women down, making them feel powerless, until they had no voice left. As the trial continued, Hemphill's fate seemed uncertain. He maintained his innocence, denying the allegations against him. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The cattle prods, the shock collars, the drugs, the restraining devices, and the surveillance footage, all told the same story. A story of power, control, and abuse. As the case developed, one thing became clear: the nightmare Hemphill had orchestrated was far more complex and insidious than anyone could have imagined. As the trial against Ryan Hemphill continued, the voices of his victims began to take center stage. Their testimonies would reveal the depth of the horror they had endured, shedding light on the psychological and physical torture they were subjected to. These women, who had once believed they were seeking financial support or a luxurious experience, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Through their accounts, the true nature of Hemphill's predatory behavior became even clearer, as they bravely came forward to describe the abuse they suffered. The first victim to testify was a woman in her late 20s, who had initially been drawn to Hemphill's promise of financial security. She described her first meeting with him, which took place in his upscale apartment. He seemed charming at first, she recalled. He was well-spoken, confident. He promised me I'd be treated well, and that I would be financially taken care of. But the moment I stepped inside, everything changed. I was drugged, and then he strapped me to a chair. She described the horror she felt as Hemphill used a cattle prod to inflict excruciating pain. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I couldn't even process what was happening to me. The shock collar on my neck felt like it was burning me from the inside out. The victim's voice trembled as she recalled the feelings of helplessness and terror. He told me if I said anything or tried to leave, he would make sure I'd never be able to speak again. As the victim continued her testimony, she detailed how Hemphill manipulated her into remaining silent. He allegedly threatened her with legal action, using his knowledge of the law to convince her that she had no recourse. He told me he'd ruin my life if I went to the police, she said. I felt like I had no choice but to comply. I was terrified of what he would do to me if I tried to get away. Her testimony was a powerful and emotional moment in the trial. Her bravery inspired others who had suffered similar abuses at Hemphill's hands to come forward. One by one, more victims shared their harrowing experiences, describing the manipulation, the pain, and the overwhelming fear they had lived with while under Hemphill's control. Another victim, a woman in her early 30s, spoke about the psychological torment Hemphill subjected her to. He was so charming, so convincing, she said. I thought he was different. I thought he was just a man looking for companionship. But once I was in his apartment, I realized that he wasn't interested in companionship at all. He wanted power. He wanted control. He wanted to make me feel small. This woman's story mirrored many others. She explained that after being drugged and restrained, Hemphill would demand compliance in exchange for the financial rewards he had promised. He used fear as a weapon, she said. Every time I tried to fight back, he made sure the consequences were worse. It felt like I was trapped in a cage, with no way to escape. The use of the shock collar was a common thread in the testimonies of these women. One victim described the feeling of the electric shock as a violent jolt that coursed through my entire body, like an electric current that didn't stop. It felt like my body was on fire, and I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. Another woman recounted how she was restrained in a chair for hours, unable to move or defend herself. I remember feeling like I was going to pass out. I kept asking him to stop, but he just smiled. He didn't care. He was enjoying it. I was nothing to him but a toy to be controlled, she said. But it wasn't just the physical abuse that these women suffered. The mental and emotional toll was equally devastating. Hemphill allegedly used psychological manipulation to break them down, making them feel as though they had no worth outside of what he wanted. One woman said, "He made me believe I was nothing without him. He would tell me I was lucky to be in his presence, that no one else would ever want me the way he did. And when I tried to leave, he would remind me that no one else would ever give me the life he promised. Perhaps the most chilling part of these accounts was how Hemphill would allegedly use the women's own personal struggles against them. Several victims described how Hemphill used their vulnerabilities, whether financial difficulties, personal trauma, or emotional instability, as leverage to manipulate them into complying. He knew how to exploit their weaknesses, and he did so with ruthless efficiency. In one instance, a woman testified that she was dealing with a recent breakup and had confided in Hemphill about her pain. He acted like he cared. He told me he understood, that he could help me feel better. But once I was alone with him, he turned into a completely different person. He used what I had told him to control me, to make me feel like I had no one else to turn to. I was completely dependent on him. As these women continued to testify, their accounts began to paint a terrifying portrait of a man who had carefully honed his ability to manipulate and abuse. Hemphill's apparent success in his professional life seemed to parallel his success in maintaining control over his victims. He used his wealth, charm, and knowledge of the law to dominate, confuse, and entrap women who sought out his companionship, but instead found themselves in a world of fear and pain. The bravery of these women, however, was not in vain. Their testimonies brought a sense of urgency to the investigation, urging the authorities to dig deeper into Hemphill's activities. With each woman's voice added to the case, it became more difficult for Hemphill to maintain his facade of innocence. The patterns of abuse were undeniable, and the truth of what had occurred behind the closed doors of his apartment was now coming into the light. As the testimonies of Hemphill's victims painted a clear and horrifying picture of his abuse, the investigation into his actions grew more intense. Law enforcement, now armed with accounts of physical and psychological torture, began to piece together the evidence that would ultimately build a strong case against the financial advisor. What they discovered during their investigation would go on to reveal just how methodical and calculated Hemphill's crimes truly were. The first breakthrough came from the victim who had managed to escape and bravely alerted authorities. This victim's decision to speak up would become the catalyst for the entire investigation. She had made a report to the police, detailing the abuse she endured in Hemphill's apartment. While her courage to come forward was important, the real turning point came when investigators were able to gain access to Hemphill's residence. With a warrant in hand, police raided his Manhattan apartment, a place that had, up until then, been the site of so much horror. What they found inside the apartment confirmed the victim's worst fears. The authorities uncovered disturbing evidence that painted Hemphill's actions as both premeditated and calculated. Among the items discovered were various devices designed to restrain and control his victims. Police found ropes, handcuffs, and chains, tools that suggested his abuse was not simply a product of violence, but of planning. Hemphill had gone to great lengths to ensure that his victims had no way of escaping once they were inside his apartment. Yet the most chilling discovery was found hidden in a closet, a large, industrial-sized cattle prod and shock collars, designed for livestock. These devices, which Hemphill allegedly used to inflict pain on his victims, were the very instruments of torment that had been mentioned by the women in their testimonies. The presence of these tools left no room for doubt. They were not ordinary household items, and their use on humans was not only cruel but entirely illegal. The cattle prods, typically used to control large animals, had been repurposed as tools for sadistic abuse. The shock collars, which could deliver an electric shock strong enough to incapacitate an animal, were allegedly used by Hemphill to humiliate and dominate his victims. The sheer nature of these devices confirmed what the victims had reported. Hemphill had turned his apartment into a chamber of control and suffering. Alongside these physical tools, investigators also found substances in Hemphill's apartment that were believed to have been used to drug his victims. Various prescription medications and controlled substances were recovered, many of which had been obtained under questionable circumstances. Some of these drugs were believed to have been slipped into drinks or food before the women were restrained, making them vulnerable to Hemphill's control. Toxicology reports from the victims confirmed that some of them had been drugged, further corroborating the investigators' suspicions. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that made this case compelling. The investigation also uncovered a treasure trove of electronic data that proved crucial. Authorities seized Hemphill's computer and phones, and upon examining these devices, they found disturbing records. Among the documents recovered were digital records from the very platforms where Hemphill had lured his victims, Seeking Arrangements, Craigslist, and FetLife. On these platforms, Hemphill had posted advertisements for wealthy men seeking companionship and had exchanged messages with numerous women, making promises of financial support in exchange for their attention. The messages, which had been carefully archived, painted a picture of manipulation and deceit. Hemphill's communications were laced with charm and promises of a better life, but beneath the surface, they revealed a man who was setting up each interaction as a means to an end: control. Investigators also discovered that Hemphill had kept meticulous records of the women he targeted, including details about their financial struggles, personal backgrounds, and even their emotional vulnerabilities. This data, combined with the other evidence found at his residence, demonstrated just how deliberate and systematic Hemphill's actions had been. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was the surveillance footage discovered on Hemphill's personal devices. It was clear from the video recordings that he had carefully documented the abuse he inflicted on his victims. The footage showed Hemphill engaging in acts of violence, restraint, and the use of the shock collars and cattle prods. The victims, unable to fight back, were shown bound and at his mercy, their expressions filled with terror. This footage not only corroborated the accounts of the victims but also provided undeniable proof of Hemphill's guilt. The images were both chilling and graphic, proof of a man who had gone beyond simple abuse and entered a realm of sadistic control. In addition to the video recordings, investigators uncovered photographs taken by Hemphill himself. These images were not of personal memories or innocent snapshots. Instead, they were images of his victims, taken while they were drugged, bound, and in compromising positions. The photos served as further evidence of his desire to degrade and humiliate those under his control. These images, in particular, would become key pieces of evidence in the trial, reinforcing the severity of the abuse. The investigation also revealed that Hemphill had gone to great lengths to ensure his actions remained hidden from the outside world. His apartment, though luxurious, had been fitted with hidden cameras, allowing him to monitor his victims and track their every move. These cameras captured every horrific moment, from the time the women entered the apartment to the moments when they were subdued, tortured, and eventually released, if they were fortunate enough to escape. As the investigation unfolded, it became evident that Hemphill's manipulation extended far beyond his victims. It was clear that he had carefully cultivated a network of trusted individuals who were either unaware of his crimes or had been bribed or coerced into silence. Investigators worked tirelessly to identify anyone who may have been complicit in his actions or who may have aided him in covering up his crimes. But for now, all focus was on Hemphill, the man at the center of this devastating web of abuse. With the mounting evidence against him, including physical tools of torture, digital communications, surveillance footage, and photographs, the case against Ryan Hemphill grew undeniable. Each piece of evidence added to the growing case that he had intentionally and systematically sought to control and destroy the lives of the women who had trusted him. The strength of the evidence meant that his arrest was only a matter of time, and soon, the wheels of justice would begin to turn, leading Hemphill to face the full consequences of his actions. With mounting evidence and a growing list of victims, the case against Ryan Hemphill quickly moved into the legal phase. Hemphill, who had maintained his innocence throughout the investigation, now found himself facing a long list of charges, ranging from sexual assault and drugging to kidnapping and torture. The strength of the evidence, combined with the powerful testimonies of his victims, left little room for doubt about his guilt. It was clear that the legal battle ahead would not only be a fight for justice but also a painful journey for those who had been affected by Hemphill's actions. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Hemphill's defense attorneys worked to challenge the evidence that had been gathered against him. They attempted to discredit the victims' testimonies, suggesting that they had fabricated their stories or misunderstood the events that transpired. They also argued that the evidence, including the photographs and surveillance footage, had been misinterpreted or taken out of context. But these tactics were met with little success. The overwhelming nature of the evidence and the consistency of the victims' accounts made it difficult for the defense to gain any traction. Despite their efforts, Hemphill's legal team faced a significant obstacle: the testimony of the victims themselves. Each woman who had been brave enough to come forward had a compelling and heartbreaking story to share. Their words, which described the abuse in vivid detail, resonated with the jurors and painted a picture of a man who had taken advantage of their vulnerabilities and subjected them to unimaginable suffering. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with a tense atmosphere. Hemphill sat quietly in his seat, flanked by his attorneys, as the victims took the stand one by one. Their voices, filled with courage and determination, rang out as they recounted their experiences. Some spoke with tears in their eyes, while others stood firm, their anger and pain clear in their expressions. For many of them, the trial was a form of closure, a chance to finally be heard after years of silence and fear. For the prosecution, securing a conviction was paramount. They presented a strong case, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The cattle prods, shock collars, and drugs were all carefully explained, each item tied to the horrific crimes Hemphill had committed. The surveillance footage was shown in court, further confirming the extent of the abuse. But it was the victim's testimony that carried the most weight, showing the emotional and psychological scars that Hemphill had left in his wake. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Hemphill's actions were not just those of a man acting out of impulse or momentary anger. He had been calculating, methodical, and deliberate. His use of drugs to incapacitate his victims, the devices to control and torture them, and his psychological manipulation all painted the picture of a man who saw his victims as nothing more than tools for his own gratification. The defense tried to argue that Hemphill was merely engaging in consensual acts or that the women had exaggerated their experiences. However, this argument fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. After weeks of intense testimony, the jury deliberated. The prosecution's case had been strong, and the evidence left little room for doubt. On the other hand, the defense struggled to provide any credible explanation for Hemphill's actions, resorting to weak counterarguments that failed to sway the jury. The victims, who had shown immense bravery throughout the trial, were now one step closer to seeing justice served. When the jury returned with a verdict, the room fell silent. Hemphill, who had sat stoically throughout the trial, now faced the consequences of his actions. He was found guilty on multiple counts, including sexual assault, torture, kidnapping, and drugging. The verdict was a moment of catharsis for the victims, who had long fought for their voices to be heard. Hemphill's conviction marked a major victory in the battle against his abuse and manipulation, sending a strong message that no one, regardless of their social status or wealth, could escape the law for their crimes. In the days following the trial, many of the victims shared their relief at seeing Hemphill held accountable for his actions. "This conviction doesn't erase what happened to me," one of the victims said, her voice filled with emotion. "But it's the first step in reclaiming my life. It's the first step in telling my story and knowing that I'm not alone." As for Ryan Hemphill, he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The exact length of his sentence was still to be determined at the time of reporting, but the conviction meant that he would be locked away for a long time. He would have to face the consequences of his actions, a stark contrast to the freedom and control he once had over his victims. For the women he had abused, this conviction represented a hard-fought victory in their pursuit of justice, a victory that came at great personal cost but ultimately allowed them to take back their power. As Ryan Hemphill faces the consequences of his actions, the legal system has ensured that justice, at least in this case, has been served. But the questions raised by this story do not end with his conviction. For the victims, the trauma they endured cannot be undone by a verdict, nor can it be erased by a prison sentence. As they continue to rebuild their lives, they must grapple with the emotional and psychological scars that remain. And as for society, this case forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of trust, manipulation, and power dynamics in relationships. How did Hemphill, a seemingly successful financial advisor, manage to deceive so many women into believing he was offering them a better life, only to subject them to unimaginable horrors? Was it his charm and manipulation that made his victims vulnerable, or did their own personal struggles play a role in how they became targets? As we look at this case, it's clear that Hemphill's actions were not born from a momentary lapse in judgment but from a calculated, methodical pattern of abuse. The victims, each of whom had their own story, represent something more than just the individuals involved. They embody the larger issue of power imbalance, how people in positions of wealth and influence can exploit those who are vulnerable or seeking support. How often do we overlook the red flags when someone seems to offer us what we need, whether it's financial stability, emotional support, or even companionship? This case raises an even more troubling question: how many other women, or people in general, are out there enduring similar forms of abuse, but have yet to find the courage to speak out? What keeps them from coming forward? Is it the fear of not being believed, the shame of being manipulated, or something else entirely? The bravery of the victims in this case is commendable, but it also highlights the need for a society that listens to and supports those who suffer in silence. While justice has been served for these women, this case is a reminder that real justice isn't just about conviction, it's about creating a culture where victims are never made to feel as though their experiences are less valid or important. It's about building systems that protect people from those who seek to take advantage of them, whether it's in the guise of a financial advisor or any other role of trust. As we reflect on Ryan Hemphill's conviction, we must also ask ourselves, what are the broader implications of his actions? Are we doing enough to address the systemic issues that allow predators like him to thrive? Are we truly equipped to support victims of abuse, especially when their trauma doesn't come in the easily recognizable forms we've come to expect? In the end, this case is not just about a man who preyed on vulnerable women, it's about all of us. It's a stark reminder of how easily trust can be manipulated and how power can be wielded in harmful ways. It compels us to think critically about the relationships we form, the people we trust, and how we can protect ourselves and others from falling victim to exploitation. We may never fully understand what drove Ryan Hemphill to commit these terrible acts. But as we reflect on the stories of his victims, we must ask, how can we, as a society, do better in recognizing the signs of abuse, providing support to those in need, and ensuring that no one else falls prey to the kind of predatory behavior Hemphill displayed? And perhaps the most important question of all, what more can we do to create a world where survivors of abuse are not only believed but supported in their journey toward healing? Story 2. April 19, 2023. The evening sun had long dipped below the horizon in Jefferson County, Colorado, casting the suburban streets in a heavy, muted darkness. For most, it was an ordinary Wednesday night. Workdays were ending, families were gathering at dinner tables, teenagers were finishing homework or scrolling endlessly through their phones. The world, for many, felt safe. Predictable. Routine. Alexa Bartell was among them. At just 20 years old, Alexa's future stretched out ahead of her like an open highway. Her friends described her as radiant, a young woman who could make anyone laugh, someone who filled a room with her energy without even trying. That night, she was doing something entirely unremarkable, driving home, chatting with a friend over the phone, the steady comfort of headlights illuminating the road ahead. It should have been just another quiet, forgettable drive. But it would be her last. Miles away, another car prowled the same streets. Inside it were three teenagers, Joseph Koenig, Nicholas Karolchik, and Zachary Kwok. They weren't headed anywhere important. No destination. No purpose beyond the chaos they had chosen to create. In their hands were rocks, large, jagged, heavy. Objects turned into weapons, fueled not by hatred, but by a reckless craving for amusement. It wasn't the first rock they hurled that night. Nor the second. Car after car, they laughed, speeding off into the night after each crash of glass and startled scream. It was a game to them. A thrill that demanded more. As Alexa drove, unaware of what was racing toward her, fate closed in. A rock, hurled with force beyond simple mischief, shattered through her windshield with a violence that gave no warning, no second chance. In an instant, everything she had been, and everything she could have become, was stolen. The call with her friend went silent. Her car veered off the road, coming to rest in a lonely field. Her phone, the last tether to the world she was part of, kept ringing, unanswered. It would be hours before anyone found her. Her friend, frantic and terrified, would use a phone tracking app to locate her: a quiet field, a wrecked car, a life extinguished with no chance to say goodbye. When authorities began to piece together what had happened, the truth they uncovered was almost too callous to comprehend. The rock that ended Alexa's life wasn't an accident. It wasn't the result of some tragic freak occurrence. It was deliberate. Chosen. Thrown by teenagers who, when it was over, returned to the scene not out of guilt, but to capture a photograph. A keepsake. Proof of what they had done. This is the story of Alexa Bartel. Of a life interrupted. Of 3 young men whose choices led to devastation beyond measure. And of a community left to wrestle with the unbearable question: how could anyone treat life so carelessly? In the next minutes, we will walk through the night of Alexa's death, the investigation that followed, and the courtroom battles that tried to bring some measure of justice to a crime that should never have happened. Her story deserves to be told in full. Not as a headline. Not as a statistic. But as a reminder, that every moment we take for granted, every voice we expect to hear again, can be stolen away in the blink of an eye, by the senseless, selfish actions of those who never paused to consider the cost. Before her name appeared in news headlines, before her photograph became a symbol of a tragedy that stunned a community, Alexa Bartel was simply Alexa. A daughter. A sister. A friend. A young woman who, at 20 years old, was still carving her place in the world, one laugh, one conversation, one quiet act of kindness at a time. She grew up in Colorado, surrounded by the people who loved her most. They describe her not just with words, but with the kind of affection that settles in their voices when they speak her name. She was vibrant, not in the loud or flashy way the world often notices, but in the way that matters most. Alexa made people feel seen. She had a way of drawing others in, of making even the most guarded hearts feel a little lighter, a little safer. Friends remember her smile, effortless, contagious, the kind of smile that could pull you out of the heaviest moment without needing to say a word. Family members talk about her loyalty, her quiet determination, her stubborn refusal to give up on the people she cared about, no matter how complicated life became. Alexa wasn't chasing fame. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was grounded in the simple, beautiful things that give life meaning: the connection between friends, the love of family, the small victories that make the future feel wide open. She was studying, working, dreaming. Doing all the things young adults do when they are just starting to imagine what their lives could become. And like so many others her age, Alexa faced the typical struggles and uncertainties that come with growing up. But she met them with a resilience that those who knew her found quietly remarkable. She had plans, not always perfectly mapped out, but real. Hopeful. Honest. On the night she died, Alexa wasn't in a rush. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't reckless. She was simply living. Doing what countless others were doing that night, driving home, talking to a friend, trusting that the world around her would remain as steady and ordinary as it had been the day before. In a just world, her story would have continued without interruption. She would have graduated, pursued her dreams, laughed at the absurdities of adulthood, fallen in love, stumbled, grown stronger. She would have had birthdays and holidays and quiet mornings where nothing happened but the simple joy of being alive. Instead, her life ended with the crushing force of a rock thrown by strangers who never knew her, who never cared to know her. In the space of a single moment, everything Alexa was, every memory she held, every dream she had yet to chase, was taken. And what remains now are the memories carried by those who loved her, the moments frozen in time. A laugh. A text message. A photo that can never be updated. A voice that will never fill a room again. This, not the crime itself, is the center of the story. Alexa Bartel was not an accident. She was not a random name. She was a person whose life mattered. Long after the courtrooms empty and the headlines fade, her story endures. In the hearts of her family. In the grief of her friends. And now, in the memory of anyone willing to remember not just how she died, but how she lived. April 19, 2023 began without warning signs. No storms brewing in the distance, no omens lingering on the horizon. Just another spring evening in Jefferson County, Colorado. By late afternoon, the ordinary rhythms of life had settled across the neighborhoods, parents returning home from work, kids gathering in parks, headlights flickering on along suburban streets as dusk deepened into night. In one part of town, Alexa Bartel finished her day much like she had countless times before. She sent a few texts, made a phone call, slipped behind the wheel of her car, and set out on a familiar drive. There was nothing remarkable about it. The highway was quiet. The roads, mostly empty. The sky overhead, stretched in darkness. At the same time, a different vehicle prowled the same county roads, but with a very different purpose. Inside were three teenagers, Joseph Koenig, Nicholas Karolchik, and Zachary Kwok. They weren't heading to a movie. They weren't visiting friends. Their mission that night was destruction. Armed with large landscaping rocks, heavy, rough, deadly. They drove through Jefferson County neighborhoods, windows down, hearts racing not with fear, but with adrenaline. They weren't just throwing rocks at the ground, or tossing them into empty fields. They aimed directly at moving vehicles. Windshields. Drivers. The first few cars they targeted were lucky. Some rocks missed completely. Others hit, but without catastrophic results, cracked windshields, startled drivers swerving, unaware of who had attacked them. Each near miss emboldened them. Each crash of rock against metal fed something reckless inside them. It wasn't enough to cause damage. They wanted impact. They wanted to see the consequences. As the night deepened, so did their recklessness. Around 10:45 p.m., Alexa was driving northbound on Indiana Street, speaking to a close friend over the phone. It was a casual conversation, the kind that fills the silence of a late-night drive. Nothing urgent. Nothing unusual. What Alexa couldn't see, what she had no way of knowing, was that the teenagers had spotted her car approaching. They had a rock ready. And this time, they didn't hesitate. A rock, approximately 5 to 10 pounds in weight, was hurled from their moving vehicle with brutal force. It flew across the darkened highway, faster than anyone could react. It smashed through Alexa's windshield, striking her with lethal impact. On the other end of the phone call, her friend heard a sudden noise, a sharp crack, and then silence. The line stayed open, but Alexa said nothing more. Her vehicle drifted off the roadway, rolling into a grassy field, where it finally came to a stop, silent, dark, still. Alexa's friend, gripped by confusion and fear, tried desperately to call her back. No answer. Text after text, call after call, all unanswered. Panic set in. Something was wrong. Within minutes, using a phone tracking app, Alexa's friend pinpointed her last known location and rushed there. When they arrived, they found Alexa's car, mangled and alone in the field. And inside, they found Alexa, lifeless, bloodied, her final moments stolen without warning, without mercy. The teenagers didn't stop after Alexa. They continued hurling rocks at other vehicles, laughing, exhilarated by the chaos they were creating. Even as law enforcement began receiving frantic 911 calls from multiple victims across the county, the teenagers were celebrating. Hours later, they would return to the scene of Alexa's crash, not to offer help, not out of guilt, but to take photographs. A trophy for themselves. Proof of what they had done. To them, it was still a night of fun. A memory to capture. A story to tell among themselves. For Alexa's family, it was the beginning of a nightmare that no one could undo. The night Alexa Bartel lost her life, Jefferson County law enforcement was overwhelmed with confusion and chaos. Calls flooded the 911 lines. Terrified drivers reporting shattered windshields, rocks flying through the darkness, injuries narrowly avoided. No one could yet piece together how these random bursts of violence fit together, or just how serious they would soon become. When deputies arrived at the scene of Alexa's crash, they found a field illuminated only by flashing red and blue lights. Her car was crumpled against the tall grass, windshield caved inward by the massive rock that still lay inside the vehicle. The damage told a story before any words were spoken. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a case of a driver losing control. Someone, had caused this. The investigation began immediately. Deputies canvassed the area, speaking with the handful of drivers who had also been struck by rocks earlier that night. Their accounts shared haunting similarities. A sudden impact. Shattered glass. A glimpse, sometimes, of headlights speeding away. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that these weren't isolated incidents, they were connected. A deliberate, coordinated attack carried out over miles of Jefferson County roads. Physical evidence was their first anchor. Fragments of broken windshields. Tire tracks in the dirt where cars had swerved off the highway. And, crucially, security camera footage from nearby homes and businesses, which captured blurry images of a dark-colored pickup truck moving erratically near the times of the attacks. Still, a key question remained: who would do this, and why? Within days, a breakthrough arrived. A young witness came forward, someone who knew Joseph Koenig personally. The tipster reported overhearing Koenig talk about throwing rocks at cars, bragging about it, even. The information was enough for detectives to focus their attention squarely on Koenig and his two closest friends, Nicholas Karolczyk and Zachary Kwok. When investigators brought the teenagers in for questioning, the story they uncovered was almost too callous to comprehend. One after another, the boys recounted the same grim timeline. Earlier that evening, they had loaded Joseph Koenig's black pickup truck with landscaping rocks stolen from construction sites. They had driven around suburban neighborhoods, laughing as they selected targets. They chose moving cars because, they said, it made the game more exciting. More dangerous. More real. But what chilled investigators even more was what happened after Alexa Bartel's death. According to interviews, after the rock struck Alexa's car and caused the fatal crash, the teenagers did not flee in fear or remorse. Instead, they circled back. They returned to the field where her lifeless car sat, broken and dark against the night. They took photographs, close-up shots of the wreckage, as if capturing a trophy to commemorate their actions. When asked why, none of the teenagers could provide a real explanation. Only shrugs. Only empty words about being curious or wanting to see the damage. No apology. No understanding of the devastation they had caused. With their confessions, and the mounting physical evidence tying them to the spree, law enforcement moved swiftly. On April 25, 2023, just 6 days after Alexa's death, Joseph Koenig, Nicholas Karolczyk, and Zachary Kwok were arrested. All three were charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder with extreme indifference, attempted murder, assault, and related crimes. The charges reflected the seriousness of their actions. This wasn't just about Alexa. It was about a community terrorized, drivers traumatized, lives nearly ended by a reckless and deliberate choice. For Alexa's family, the arrests brought some measure of relief, but no real comfort. No arrest could undo what had been taken from them. The investigation had exposed the depth of cruelty behind the crime, but it also revealed something harder to explain. How easily life could be shattered by a decision so thoughtless, so casual, that even those responsible struggled to grasp the full weight of what they had done. The road to justice was just beginning. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in, their expressions solemn, bearing the weight of a decision that would forever alter multiple lives. Joseph Koenig, now 20, stood accused of first-degree murder in the death of Alexa Bartel, along with multiple counts of attempted murder and assault related to a series of rock-throwing incidents. The prosecution presented a compelling case, highlighting the deliberate nature of the attacks. Chief Deputy District Attorney Catherine Decker emphasized the frequency and focus of the assaults, noting that the rocks were consistently aimed at the driver's side of vehicles. She detailed how Koenig, while driving at high speeds, hurled a 9-pound rock through Alexa's windshield, killing her instantly. Testimonies from Koenig's co-defendants, Nicholas Karolczyk and Zachary Kwok, were pivotal. Both had entered plea agreements in exchange for their cooperation. Karolczyk, once a close friend of Koenig, initially attempted to shield him but eventually admitted that Koenig had thrown the fatal rock. Kwok corroborated this account, stating that Koenig appeared excited after the incident. The defense argued that Koenig did not intend to kill and suffered from a personality disorder affecting his judgment. They contended that he should be convicted of a lesser charge, such as manslaughter. However, the jury found the evidence of deliberate and reckless behavior overwhelming. After deliberating for approximately 7 hours, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder. Koenig faces a mandatory life sentence, with sentencing scheduled for June 3. Outside the courtroom, Alexa's mother, Kelly Bartell, expressed a complex mix of emotions. While acknowledging that justice had been served, she lamented the loss of not only her daughter but also the futures of the young men involved. "It's hard to be happy or feel satisfied that justice was served today because I feel one amazing life was lost, and 3 others are also lost and impacted," she said. The trial concluded, but the impact of that night in April 2023 continues to resonate, a stark reminder of how a moment's decision can lead to irreversible consequences. After a verdict was delivered, all eyes turned to the sentencing phase, the moment where justice, measured by the severity of the crimes committed, would finally settle on Joseph Koenig, Nicholas Karolczyk, and Zachary Kwok. But no sentence could ever reverse the tragedy that unfolded on the night Alexa Bartell lost her life. The trial had been grueling, with emotions running high. While many believed that justice had been served with the guilty verdicts, what followed was a new chapter of reckoning, not just for the young men responsible, but for the entire community. For Alexa's mother, Kelly Bartell, the journey to this point had been emotionally overwhelming. In her statements following the trial, she expressed a profound sorrow that went beyond the courtroom's verdict. "We can never get Alexa back. This trial, this conviction, it doesn't fix what's been broken," she said. It was clear, even with Koenig's conviction on all counts, including first-degree murder, there would be no closure. Only an irreversible loss. As for Koenig, Karolczyk, and Kwok, their fate was now in the hands of Judge Elizabeth Hatcher, who had presided over the trial. Each of the young men stood in stark contrast to the boisterous, reckless teens who had initiated the rock-throwing spree. Koenig, especially, faced life-altering consequences. His actions had not only cost an innocent woman her life but had triggered a chain reaction that left scars on a community and shattered the lives of 3 young men who had once been friends. On June 3, 2023, Koenig's sentencing was a moment laden with emotion and gravity. The courtroom was filled with Alexa's family, friends, and members of the public, each of them grappling with the stark reality of the justice system's role in delivering a final reckoning for a crime so senseless. Koenig, dressed in a crisp suit, sat at the defense table, his demeanor cold and detached, offering little emotion as the sentence was read aloud. His defense attorneys had pleaded for leniency, citing his troubled upbringing and mental health issues, suggesting that a combination of factors led to his momentary lapse in judgment. They also requested the possibility of parole after a certain number of years, a chance, however slim, for Koenig to rebuild his life. However, Judge Hatcher had a different view. She acknowledged the psychological factors mentioned, but she couldn't ignore the intentional nature of the crimes. It was made clear that despite Koenig's youth, his actions were deliberate and devastating. Koenig's sentence was one of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a reflection of the brutality and indifference that had been shown when he decided to take a life, all for the sake of a twisted thrill. The story was different for Karolczyk and Kwok. Unlike Koenig, the two had cooperated fully with law enforcement and testified against their former friend during the trial. As part of plea deals, Carol Chick and Kwok had pled guilty to charges of second-degree murder and attempted murder. They were spared the severity of a first-degree murder conviction, but the community's pain remained. Carol Chick was sentenced to 22 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 16 years, depending on his behavior and rehabilitation progress. He was seen by many as a young man who had made a series of poor choices but who might still have a chance at redemption if he turned his life around behind bars. Kwok, likewise, was sentenced to 20 years with the possibility of parole. Both sentences were considered relatively lenient, but many saw them as a reflection of the teens' cooperation and the nature of their involvement in the crime. They had not been the ones to throw the fatal rock, but they had participated in the crime spree, and they had chosen to remain in the car, observing the carnage unfold without taking steps to prevent it. The sentences brought a sense of finality, but the pain was far from over. For the community of Jefferson County, this tragedy would forever shape their sense of security. People who had driven those roads at night, oblivious to the peril around them, now questioned every moment spent behind the wheel. Parents, shaken by the sheer randomness of the crime, began having difficult conversations with their children about violence, choices, and consequences. What had seemed like a senseless crime committed by a few reckless teens turned into a catalyst for a broader societal conversation. People began to ask, what drives someone to such a point? What can we do to prevent another tragedy like this from unfolding? For Kelly Bartell, the mourning did not stop after the trial or the sentencing. She continued to speak out about her daughter's legacy, reminding the world that behind the media coverage and legal proceedings was a life lost too soon. Alexa was a force of light. She had her whole life ahead of her. She could have changed the world, and I want her to be remembered as someone who brought joy to everyone she met. These words echoed in her public statements, underscoring the heartache that would never fade. Her family started a foundation in Alexa's name, focusing on mental health awareness and prevention of violence, aiming to provide support for others who had experienced trauma or lost loved ones to senseless acts of violence. Alexa's friends and peers rallied around this cause, ensuring that her light, although extinguished far too early, would continue to shine through the work that would honor her name. The sentencing phase concluded, but the aftermath was far from finished. As the community came to terms with the tragedy, so too did the three young men who had been sentenced. Joseph Koenig would spend the rest of his life in prison, a life defined by a single choice, a moment of madness that claimed an innocent life and destroyed his own. For Carol Chick and Kwok, their futures remained uncertain, shaped by the decisions they had made in a moment of peer pressure and misjudgment. But for Alexa Bartell's family, the real justice was not in the sentences handed down that day. The justice they sought, the one that might bring some peace, was found in their daughter's legacy, a reminder that while the criminal justice system may deliver its verdict, there is never true closure in the face of such profound loss. As the trial and sentencing came to a close, a ripple effect spread across the community, and beyond. This was no longer just about the fate of three young men. The tragedy of Alexa Bartell's death had sparked a wider conversation about reckless behavior, mental health, peer pressure, and the vulnerability of those who share our public spaces. It became a case that not only demanded justice but also called for reflection and action. How could something so senseless, so random, happen? And how could it be prevented in the future? One of the most important lessons to be taken from this case was the glaring issue of mental health. While Joseph Koenig's defense team had presented evidence of his troubled upbringing and psychological struggles, they had not made an excuse for his actions. Yet, it opened a wider conversation: how much responsibility does society have in addressing the mental health of its youth? For many, Koenig's actions were the result of not only a distorted sense of thrill-seeking but also a failure to recognize the depth of his emotional turmoil and mental instability. Are we doing enough to provide young people with the tools they need to cope with their emotions in healthy ways? What if early intervention, through counseling, education, and community support, could have changed the trajectory of these young men's lives before a rock was ever thrown? While mental health was a key issue, the element of peer pressure played a central role in this crime. Koenig wasn't alone in his decision to terrorize innocent drivers. He had companions who participated, and who, in the moment, did not question the morality of their actions. Why is it that so many young people, when faced with pressure from their peers, lose their sense of responsibility and accountability? This case underscored the dangers of unchecked peer influence and the importance of fostering critical thinking in adolescence. Should we be teaching our children more than just the dangers of risky behavior? How can we instill the values of courage and morality in the next generation, the courage to stand up when something feels wrong, even when everyone else seems to be going along with it? The ease with which Koenig's friends were drawn into his actions illustrated how a lack of personal boundaries and moral grounding can result in tragedy. How much do we, as a society, influence the moral compass of our youth, and what steps can we take to make sure that peer influence leads them toward positive choices, rather than destructive ones? One of the key turning points in this case was the involvement of the community, the witnesses who reported seeing suspicious vehicles, the brave souls who came forward to share what they had seen. In the end, it was the courage of a few individuals that helped bring justice, ensuring that the teenagers responsible would face the consequences of their actions. What role do we, as individuals and communities, play in preventing tragedies like this? When we see something wrong, do we speak up, or do we turn away, hoping someone else will intervene? It was the community's vigilance that brought the case to light, and without it, justice might not have been served. Communities must support one another, report suspicious activity, and take the steps necessary to protect their shared spaces. How can we foster an environment where people feel empowered to act, where standing up for what's right becomes second nature, rather than the exception? The tragic rock-throwing spree that led to Alexa Bartel's death has also sparked a national conversation about how to prevent similar incidents. Lawmakers and community leaders began discussing ways to increase education about the dangers of reckless behavior, especially among young people. What if every school, every community center, could offer programs that not only educate about risky behaviors but also focus on teaching emotional regulation, empathy, and conflict resolution? But beyond education, there's a pressing need for better access to mental health resources, especially for teens and young adults. How many more lives will be lost if we continue to overlook the mental health struggles of young people? What if accessible therapy and counseling services were as common as sports teams or extracurricular clubs? Could tragedies like Alexa's be prevented? When teenagers are struggling, whether with anxiety, depression, or other mental health challenges, they often lack the tools to process their emotions in healthy ways. How can we ensure that young people don't fall through the cracks, that no one feels isolated, unheard, or abandoned? The sentences handed down to Koenig, Karol Chick, and Kwok were seen by many as a necessary step toward justice. But for those closest to Alexa, the question of redemption was much harder to answer. Could these young men ever redeem themselves for taking a life? Is redemption possible when the consequences of your actions are irreversible? It's a question that has no simple answer. While Koenig will serve life in prison, Karol Chick and Kwok face long sentences of their own, with the possibility of parole. What does redemption look like for those who have caused immense harm? Can we ever fully understand the depth of a crime until we look at the lives shattered by it? For some, this story may spark a desire to change, to make amends, to seek help and to understand the true weight of their actions. For others, the prison sentence may serve as the only real consequence. How do we balance justice with compassion, and can the two ever coexist in a case like this? As Alexa's family continues to mourn their unimaginable loss, they also work to ensure that her legacy is remembered not for how she died but for how she lived. Alexa Bartel was a beloved daughter, friend, and community member who had the world at her feet. Her life was taken far too soon, but her spirit lives on in the work her family has done to raise awareness about the dangers of reckless violence and the need for greater mental health resources. What will Alexa's legacy be? Will it be one of pain, or will it inspire others to make different choices, to think before acting, and to treat each other with more kindness and care? Can her family's grief become a source of strength and change that will save lives in the future? In the aftermath of this tragedy, Alexa's name has become synonymous with the importance of making responsible choices and the need for accountability in the face of senseless harm. As her family works to raise awareness and prevent similar tragedies, they remind us all of the fragile nature of life and the far-reaching consequences of our actions. In the end, the message is clear: our actions have consequences, both for ourselves and for others. How often do we stop to think about the ripple effects of our decisions? A single, thoughtless decision can change the course of history, rip families apart, and alter the very fabric of a community. This case serves as a stark reminder that we must not just protect ourselves from harm, but we must also protect each other. By fostering empathy, providing mental health support, and teaching young people about the lasting impact of their choices, we can begin to create a world where senseless violence like the rock-throwing spree that killed Alexa Bartel becomes a thing of the past. Story 3. There are places in America where life seems simple. Places where families grow up together, where neighbors trust one another, and where tragedy feels like something that happens far away, to strangers, not to people you know. In Mount Holly, North Carolina, Joshua and Stacy Hunsucker were part of that picture. A young couple. Smiling. Building a life. Raising 2 little girls. Joshua worked as a paramedic, a man trained to respond to emergencies with calm and precision. Stacy was bright, caring, devoted to her daughters. She worked for a church ministry, offering her time to others who needed help. They lived in a modest home, not far from the Catawba River. On weekends, they went to church, attended soccer games, barbecued with family. On the surface, there was no reason for anyone to think that anything was wrong. But in September of 2018, everything changed. Joshua called 911 from their home. Stacy was unresponsive. He performed CPR. He told the dispatcher he had found her struggling to breathe, and then, moments later, her heart had stopped. When paramedics arrived, there was little they could do. Stacy Hunsucker was pronounced dead at the hospital that day. She was just 32 years old. Friends grieved. Family members clung to one another for answers. But it wasn't long before quiet doubts began to surface. Questions that no one wanted to ask, but couldn't ignore. Why had a healthy young woman, with no serious medical history, suddenly died at home? Why was there such urgency to have her cremated, without a full autopsy? And why, just days later, did her husband receive nearly $250,000 in life insurance benefits? At first, the murmurs stayed quiet. People told themselves it was just heartbreak. They told themselves Joshua was a widower, raising 2 small children alone. They told themselves that sometimes terrible things happen without reason. But the truth was waiting, hidden in the most unexpected place. It would take over a year, determined investigators, and one unlikely witness to begin uncovering what really happened inside the Hunsucker home. It began with a babysitter. A young woman who had been hired to help care for Joshua and Stacy's daughters after Stacy's passing. At first, she thought she was simply stepping into the role of caregiver, someone to ease the burden of a grieving father. But slowly, she noticed things that unsettled her. Conversations that didn't add up. Details about Stacy's final hours that changed from one telling to the next. There were offhand remarks Joshua made about money, about the insurance payments he had received. Remarks about Stacy's health, suggesting problems that family members swore had never existed. And then there was the way Joshua moved on. Not with the weight of a man shattered by loss, but with the quickness of someone eager to leave the past behind. Within months, he was dating again. He was traveling. He was celebrating. The babysitter, who had grown close to Stacy's family, couldn't shake her doubts. She shared her concerns. And Stacy's mother, already troubled by unanswered questions, made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. Stacy's mother requested an investigation. She wanted to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She remembered that at the hospital, shortly after Stacy had passed, a sample of her blood had been preserved. In death, Stacy could no longer speak for herself. But her blood could. When that sample was quietly tested months later, the results were staggering. Stacy's body contained an extremely high level of tetrahydrozoline, a chemical found in over-the-counter eye drops. A substance harmless when used as directed, but potentially fatal when ingested in large amounts. It was not an accident. It was not a medical mystery. It was something far more deliberate. Investigators began piecing together a story that had gone unseen in the months following Stacy's death. A story hidden in plain sight, protected by grief, by shock, and by trust. They learned that Stacy had no known illnesses that would have explained her sudden collapse. They learned that Joshua, a trained medical professional, would have known exactly how to use tetrahydrozoline to cause harm, and how difficult it would be to detect if no autopsy was performed. They uncovered financial records. A life insurance policy totaling $250,000, paid to Joshua within weeks of Stacy's cremation. A second policy valued at over $100,000 still pending approval at the time of her death. They found inconsistencies in Joshua's statements. Moments where timelines didn't match. Moments where the grief he displayed in public seemed rehearsed, while in private, his actions told a different story. And yet, for more than a year, no charges were filed. There were whispers, there were rumors, but no official accusations. It was not until December 2019, over 15 months after Stacy's death, that Joshua Hunsucker was arrested and charged with her murder. News of the arrest spread quickly across North Carolina. A man once trusted to save lives now stood accused of taking the life of the woman he had once vowed to love and protect. And as investigators dug deeper, the case only grew more disturbing. Because Joshua's story wasn't finished. In time, he would face new allegations involving his own daughter, and an even more tangled web of deceit. This is the story of Joshua Hunsucker. A story of betrayal. A story of trust shattered in the most devastating way imaginable. A story that asks, how well do we ever really know the people we love? Joshua Hunsucker grew up in North Carolina, part of a family known for its deep ties to the community. He was smart, capable, and outwardly kind. After high school, he pursued a career in emergency services, training to become a paramedic, a job that demanded quick thinking, long hours, and a calm hand under pressure. People trusted him. They depended on him during the worst moments of their lives. And by all accounts, Joshua took pride in that responsibility. It was during these early years that he met Stacy Robinson. Stacy was everything people admired. She was warm, compassionate, with a quiet strength that drew people in. After graduating from college, she dedicated herself to work in ministry, helping families in crisis, offering her time to those who had none to spare. Their relationship moved quickly. They married, bought a modest home in Mount Holly, and soon after, welcomed their first daughter. A second daughter followed just a few years later. Friends described them as a picture of a young family on the rise, church on Sundays, soccer games on Saturdays, birthday parties filled with laughter. From the outside, their life looked full, busy, and blessed. Stacy was deeply involved with her church community. She taught Sunday school. She volunteered for outreach programs. She was known for her kindness, her patience, her ability to make anyone feel at home. Joshua's schedule was harder to pin down. Working in emergency services meant long shifts, overnight calls, and days when he would be gone for hours without warning. But no one questioned it. In towns like Mount Holly, where everyone knows everyone, there's a deep instinct to trust, especially those who wear the uniform of a first responder. To the people around them, Joshua and Stacy seemed like a family you could believe in. Stable. Hardworking. Good-hearted. But as time would reveal, appearances can be deceiving. There were small things, if you knew where to look. Moments that, at the time, might have been brushed aside. Little remarks, brief flashes of frustration, choices that didn't quite fit the image of the life they had built. Joshua, friends would later say, sometimes spoke about money in ways that unsettled them. About wanting more, a bigger house, a better car, vacations that always seemed just out of reach. He worked hard, long hours, sometimes picking up additional shifts at a local hospital. But there was a restlessness underneath it. A sense that he believed he deserved more than what he had. Stacy, by contrast, was content. She wasn't concerned with status or image. Her focus remained on her daughters, her faith, her home. She was the steady center of their small world, the one who organized family dinners, who stayed up late helping with school projects, who made sure every holiday felt like magic. For years, they kept moving forward. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. First days of school. All the milestones that families treasure, carefully photographed, shared with grandparents, tucked into albums. But no life is perfect, no marriage without its strain. Behind closed doors, there were arguments, some about finances, some about time, some about loyalty stretched too thin. Friends would later recall hearing Stacy express quiet worries. Concerns that Joshua was growing distant, spending more time away from home, becoming harder to reach. Still, no one saw what was coming. No one believed that their story would end in tragedy. In the late summer of 2018, Stacy's world appeared much the same from the outside. She continued her work at the church, attended school events for her daughters, made plans for the upcoming holidays. There were text messages to friends, conversations about fall decorations, recipes she wanted to try. Nothing that would have suggested she was living through her final weeks. But there were moments, fleeting, quiet, that in hindsight feel heavier. Stacy had begun mentioning bouts of fatigue. Occasional nausea. Episodes of feeling faint that she struggled to explain. She chalked it up to stress. The pace of raising young children, balancing work and home, supporting a husband with an unpredictable schedule. There were no major doctor visits. No formal diagnoses. Nothing that raised alarm bells loud enough to stop life from moving forward. Around this same time, Joshua's behavior shifted in ways few noticed at first. He began making comments about their financial situation. Remarks that hinted at burdens Stacy had never spoken about. Remarks that, in the weeks to come, would seem chilling in their simplicity. In early September, Stacy made plans with her mother to take the girls shopping for new clothes. She laughed easily that day, picked out outfits, talked about upcoming church events. There was no sign of fear. No sense that she believed her time was running short. And then, just days later, came the morning that would change everything. The morning Joshua Hunsucker called 911 from their home, his voice measured as he reported that his wife was unresponsive. September 23, 2018, began like so many other Sundays in the Hunsucker home. The weather was mild. The air carried the first hints of autumn. Stacy had plans for the day, errands to run, church services to attend, small tasks that marked an ordinary life in motion. At some point that morning, according to Joshua, Stacy said she wasn't feeling well. She mentioned feeling tired. Maybe it was a cold coming on, she thought. Maybe just exhaustion after a busy week. There were no frantic calls to doctors. No rush to the emergency room. Just another quiet morning, unfolding without urgency. Joshua told authorities he was in another room when he heard something, a noise he couldn't quite describe. He found Stacy slumped over, unresponsive. He said he immediately began CPR. He said he called 911. The recording of that 911 call would later be played again and again, scrutinized for every word, every pause. Joshua's voice sounded controlled. Calm. Not the frantic tone many might expect from a husband discovering his wife unconscious. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They found Stacy in cardiac arrest. They worked on her as they transported her to the hospital, fighting to restore a heartbeat, fighting to reverse what had already begun slipping away. But it was too late. Stacy was pronounced dead at the hospital that same morning. 32 years old. Mother of 2. Gone without warning. At the hospital, the waiting room filled with grief. Stacy's mother arrived. So did other family members. They wept. They clung to one another. No one could make sense of what had happened. Joshua, according to those present, appeared composed. Grieving, yes, but not in the way many expected. There were no outbursts. No collapse. He spoke with doctors, answered questions from nurses, made arrangements with quiet efficiency. It was Joshua who insisted on having Stacy's body cremated. Quickly. Without an autopsy. He said he didn't want her to be cut open. He said she would have wanted to be laid to rest as soon as possible. In their shock and pain, the family did not push back. They wanted to honor Stacy's memory, not prolong their agony. And so, within days, Stacy's body was cremated. Removing forever the clearest opportunity to determine how, exactly, her life had ended. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. No one suspected foul play, at least, not officially. But for Stacy's mother, something about it never sat right. The speed of it all. The way Joshua seemed so ready to move forward. The way questions were brushed aside, as if the answers didn't matter. In the months that followed, those uneasy feelings would grow stronger. And Joshua Hunsucker's carefully constructed story would begin to crack. The first cracks in Joshua's story came not from the authorities, but from a quiet voice in the background. A babysitter, who had been hired to help care for the Hunsucker children, began to notice things that didn't align with what she had been told about Stacy's death. She remembered how quickly Joshua moved on, how little he seemed to be affected by the loss of his wife. She remembered the way he casually mentioned his life insurance payouts, conversations that left her feeling unsettled. She also recalled moments when Joshua would speak about Stacy's health, claiming she had been suffering from various illnesses that no one had ever heard her mention. The babysitter, who had gotten close to Stacy's family over time, started feeling more and more uncomfortable. Stacy's mother, still struggling with the suddenness of her daughter's death, began to grow more suspicious. She started asking questions. Why had there been no autopsy? Why had Stacy been cremated so quickly? Stacy's mother, unwilling to let her daughter's death remain a mystery, began pressing for answers. And that's when the breakthrough came, in a form no one could have predicted. A blood sample taken from Stacy at the hospital had been stored. The family requested that it be tested, hoping to find any clue that could explain Stacy's sudden and unexplained death. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the investigation. Stacy had an extremely high level of tetrahydrozoline, the active ingredient found in common over-the-counter eye drops, in her system. It was a substance that, when ingested in large doses, could cause respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, and death. It was a chemical that Joshua, as a paramedic, would have known about all too well. The truth could no longer be ignored. What had once seemed like a natural death, a tragic but unexplained loss, now appeared to be something far more deliberate. And with that revelation, the investigation into Stacy Hunsucker's death was no longer just about grief. It was about justice. By December 2019, over a year after Stacy's death, Joshua Hunsucker was arrested. The charge, first-degree murder. The arrest came after months of painstaking investigation, fueled by Stacy's mother's relentless pursuit of the truth. With the new evidence, the toxicology report, the suspicious behavior, law enforcement finally had a case they could build. Joshua's response to the arrest was shockingly calm. He denied any wrongdoing, insisting that Stacy's death had been a tragic accident. But the evidence, now growing more compelling by the day, told a different story. In the courtroom, Joshua's calm demeanor persisted. He appeared composed, even as the prosecution laid out the chilling details. The blood test showing high levels of tetrahydrozoline. The evidence of the life insurance payouts. The strange behavior in the days leading up to Stacy's death. His defense team tried to claim that Stacy's death was a result of some unknown, natural cause, something unrelated to any deliberate act. They suggested that perhaps Stacy had inadvertently ingested the substance, that there was no malice involved. But the prosecution painted a different picture, one of cold calculation. Joshua Hunsucker, they argued, had the knowledge and the means to commit the crime. As a paramedic, he understood the risks of tetrahydrozoline, how it could be fatal in large doses. He also knew how difficult it would be to detect without proper investigation. In the months after Stacy's death, he had moved on quickly, all the while cashing in on life insurance policies totaling over $350,000. The public watched, riveted, as the case continued to unfold. Some believed in his innocence. But many were horrified by the thought that a man who had once sworn to save lives could now stand accused of taking one, in the most calculated way imaginable. The courtroom became the stage where Joshua Hunsucker's carefully crafted story would be challenged. Throughout the proceedings, Joshua remained composed, offering no outward signs of guilt. His expression was calm, often unreadable. But behind those eyes, something changed. The facade of the loving husband and devoted father began to fracture, piece by piece. The prosecution focused on two critical pieces of evidence that painted a damning picture. First, the toxicology report. Stacy's blood had shown the presence of tetrahydrozoline, the active ingredient in eye drops, a substance that, when ingested in significant amounts, could cause respiratory failure, a heart attack, and ultimately, death. Joshua, as a trained paramedic, would have known this. He would have known exactly how to use this chemical, how to hide the signs of poisoning. And perhaps most chilling of all, he would have known that without an autopsy, the cause of death could easily be mistaken for something else. A tragic, unexplained collapse that no one could have predicted. The second piece of evidence was far more personal, the financial motive. In the months leading up to Stacy's death, Joshua had taken out multiple life insurance policies on her life. The total payout was substantial, over $350,000. Less than a week after Stacy's death, Joshua began the process of collecting on those policies, his grief still fresh but his financial interests already clear. The defense, of course, had their own narrative. They argued that Stacy's death had been a tragic accident. They suggested she could have ingested the tetrahydrozoline by mistake, perhaps from a bottle left carelessly within reach. It was a possibility they tried to paint as reasonable, something that could happen to anyone. But as the trial progressed, the prosecution dismantled this theory. They pointed out the quickness with which Joshua moved forward after Stacy's death, the immediate decision to have her cremated, the lack of hesitation in the face of any doubts or questions. They brought forward testimony from friends and family who described Joshua's odd behavior in the days following his wife's sudden passing, his ability to compartmentalize, to remain unfazed when most would be consumed with grief. One key moment in the trial came when a former colleague of Joshua's from the paramedic service took the stand. This witness revealed that Joshua had spoken casually about the potential of poisoning someone with eye drops. He had made comments about it in jest, but those who knew him felt a chill at the time. It was a strange comment to make, one that seemed to echo the very act he would later be accused of committing. The defense attempted to discredit these claims, painting the testimony as speculative and irrelevant. But the jury was unconvinced. The evidence was too strong, the motives too clear. As the days passed and closing arguments approached, it became increasingly apparent that Joshua's defense had failed to persuade. The jury, after careful deliberation, would have to decide, was this a case of a tragic accident, or was it the deliberate act of a man driven by greed and a callous desire for financial gain? On January 17, 2020, the jury returned to the courtroom with their verdict. They had deliberated for over 11 hours. The tension in the room was thick, every person waiting for the moment that would either exonerate Joshua or seal his fate. And then, the foreman stood and read the words that would forever change Joshua Hunsucker's life. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. The room fell silent. Joshua's face remained neutral, but his eyes betrayed something, a flicker of disbelief, perhaps. His defense team, stunned, stood by him, but there was no denying the gravity of the moment. Joshua was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Stacy's family, the verdict brought a sense of justice, though it could never truly replace the loss of their beloved daughter and mother. Stacy's mother, who had fought tirelessly for the truth, spoke after the trial, saying, "No amount of time will ever bring Stacy back, but at least we know the truth. At least we have justice." Joshua Hunsucker's story, once built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled in front of a courtroom. The man who had once vowed to save lives now faced the consequences of taking one in cold blood. The sentencing of Joshua Hunsucker marked the end of a long and painful chapter for the Hunsucker family, but the scars left by Stacy's death would remain for years to come. Justice had been served, but there was no undoing the tragedy. No returning to the family they had once been. Stacy's mother, still grieving, spoke often about her daughter in the years that followed. She made sure Stacy's name was never forgotten, that the story of her life and death was shared in the hopes of raising awareness about the dangers of toxic substances, and how easily a life can be taken, not by a weapon or violent act, but with something as ordinary as eye drops. Stacy's children, too, would carry the weight of this tragedy. They would grow up without their mother, without the warmth of her presence, without the guidance she would have provided. But they would grow up knowing that their mother's death was not in vain. Their grandmother had fought tirelessly for answers, and through that struggle, they had learned that justice, no matter how long it took, was worth fighting for. For Joshua, prison became his new reality. Once a man who had dedicated his life to saving others, he now faced the harsh consequences of a crime he could not undo. Life behind bars was his punishment, a life sentence that would stretch on for decades, a reminder that his selfish actions had forever altered the lives of those he had once vowed to protect. The case of Stacy Hunsucker serves as a stark reminder of the fragile nature of life, and the darkness that can exist even in the most seemingly stable relationships. It serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked access to toxic substances, and the lengths some will go to for money and control. But perhaps most of all, Stacy's story is one of resilience, of a family that, despite unimaginable pain, refused to let the truth remain buried. Stacy's legacy lives on, not in the tragedy of her death, but in the love she gave to her children, the community she served, and the justice her family so fiercely sought. What would drive someone to take the life of a loved one in such a calculated, cold manner? How can we begin to understand the true extent of the pain caused by a person's betrayal, especially when it's someone trusted to protect and care for us? Could you ever imagine the feeling of being betrayed by someone you loved so deeply, someone who shared your life, your children, your home? And in the end, what does justice truly mean when it comes to a tragedy like this? Do you believe that the life sentence Joshua Hunsucker received was enough, or does justice extend beyond a courtroom verdict? What lessons can we take from Stacy's story? About love, loss, and the lengths we must go to in order to seek truth, even when it seems impossible. Story 4. On a bright, sunny morning in the heart of suburban America, a community was preparing to celebrate one of the most patriotic holidays of the year, the 4th of July. In Highland Park, Illinois, families lined the streets, eager for the annual parade that would mark the beginning of the day's festivities. Children were excited, waving flags, and the air was filled with a sense of joy and unity. But beneath the surface of what seemed like an ordinary celebration, a horrifying reality was about to unfold. At approximately 10:14 a.m., everything changed. What began as a day of merrymaking quickly turned into one of the most devastating events in the city's history. The sounds of laughter and music were abruptly replaced by something else, something far more terrifying. Chaos erupted as shots rang out, sending the crowd into a panicked frenzy. Within moments, lives were lost, and a community that had once been peaceful was left reeling in shock and grief. The shooter, a young man, barely out of his teens, had carefully planned his attack, yet his name was largely unknown to the world. His actions would leave an indelible mark on the town and become the subject of national debate. As the investigation unfolded, questions began to arise. Who was this individual? What drove him to carry out such a heinous act on a day meant to celebrate freedom? And how could someone like him, with a troubling history, have slipped through the cracks? In this story, we will retrace the events of that fateful day. We will explore the details of the shooting, the chilling moments of terror, and the aftermath that would forever change the lives of those involved. But beyond the tragedy itself, we will also seek to understand the man behind the violence, his background, and what led him to commit such a horrific crime. Before he became infamous for a tragedy that shocked the nation, Robert Crimo III was, in many ways, a typical suburban teenager. Born on September 20, 2000, in Highland Park, Illinois, he grew up in a town that was known for its affluent neighborhoods and quiet, family-friendly atmosphere. His father, Bob Crimo, was a local businessman, and his mother, Denise, worked as a homemaker. On the surface, the Crimo family appeared to lead a normal life, but underneath, there were signs that all was not well. From a young age, Robert exhibited behaviors that many would later look back on with a sense of unease. Described by those who knew him as quiet and withdrawn, he struggled to connect with peers and often kept to himself. While these traits could be attributed to introversion, there were other indicators that pointed to a more complex inner world. Crimo's mental health struggles were apparent in his adolescence. Friends and family members later revealed that he often spoke about dark, disturbing thoughts. His social media presence, which would later become a chilling window into his psyche, was filled with disturbing imagery and violent themes. As early as his high school years, Crimo began posting videos and images on platforms like YouTube and Instagram that alluded to violence, isolation, and an unsettling fascination with weapons. Despite these troubling signs, Robert's family and friends did not fully understand the extent of his mental health challenges. His behavior, while odd and occasionally concerning, was not overtly alarming enough to raise immediate red flags with those closest to him. For many, it seemed as though he was simply a misunderstood young man trying to find his place in the world. But in retrospect, his actions spoke volumes about the inner turmoil he was experiencing. As Crimo moved through high school, his grades were mediocre at best, and he struggled to form lasting friendships. Still, he showed a particular interest in music and video production. His early music videos, which were uploaded online, featured eerie imagery, including masked figures and cryptic symbols. These videos, while not widely known at the time, would later become a part of the narrative surrounding his eventual descent into violence. But what about his family? What role did they play in shaping the person Robert Crimo would become? Crimo's family life, on the surface, seemed typical for a middle-class suburban household. His father, Bob, had a successful career as a small business owner, running a store that specialized in dietary supplements. His mother, Denise, was described as being supportive but somewhat detached. Robert's parents were divorced when he was a teenager, though his relationship with both of them remained relatively stable. Still, the separation may have left an emotional mark on him. In interviews following the shooting, it became apparent that Crimo's family had not been entirely unaware of his unusual behavior. His father, Bob, was reported to have had a strained relationship with his son in the years leading up to the attack. Crimo's father had reportedly been concerned about his son's mental health but did not take any major steps to address the issues, such as seeking professional help. Despite these concerns, Robert's access to firearms would not be restricted, and this lack of intervention would prove to be a crucial factor in the tragic events that followed. In the months before the shooting, Crimo was reportedly living alone in an apartment above his father's business. It was here that he would plan and prepare for his attack, often isolating himself from the outside world. His social media accounts became a place where he could express his disturbing thoughts and fantasies, though it was largely ignored by those who followed him. But it wasn't just his family life that shaped Robert Crimo III. The wider societal issues surrounding mental health, the availability of weapons, and a growing sense of alienation among young people also played a part in his trajectory. His story is a tragic reminder of the many complexities surrounding violence and the warning signs that often go unnoticed or ignored. The morning of July 4, 2022, began as any other 4th of July in Highland Park. The streets were filled with families, friends, and neighbors, all gathered for the town's annual parade. The air was filled with excitement, laughter, and the sounds of festive music. But just hours later, this peaceful celebration would be marred by an act of violence that would change the town forever. At approximately 10:14 a.m., the first shots rang out. Robert Crimo III had positioned himself on the roof of a nearby commercial building, a place he had carefully chosen for its vantage point over the parade route. From there, he was able to survey the crowds below and prepare for his attack. Using a powerful, high-caliber rifle, an AR-15 style weapon, Crimo began firing into the unsuspecting crowd. The first few shots were scattered, but soon they found their mark. As the shots echoed through the streets, panic set in. Parade goers, many of whom had been there to enjoy the festivities with their children, were thrown into chaos. People screamed, fled in every direction, and tried to shield their loved ones from the onslaught of gunfire. At this point, the authorities were still unaware of the gunman's exact location, and the parade ground became a chaotic scene of confusion. Many didn't realize they were under attack at first. People took cover behind cars, trash cans, and street signs, but there was little they could do to escape the barrage of bullets that continued to rain down from above. Crimo had been preparing for this moment for months, and his execution was methodical. He used a ladder to access the roof, bringing his weapon and ammunition with him. Once on the roof, he set up his rifle and began shooting with precision, knowing the chaos it would cause. The shooting lasted only a few minutes, but in that short span, Crimo managed to inflict unimaginable damage. Once the shooting stopped, Crimo calmly left his position. He blended into the crowd and fled the scene, hiding his weapon and rifle bag under a nearby tree. At this point, authorities had no idea who the shooter was or where he had gone. In the wake of the attack, 7 people were confirmed dead, and at least 48 others were wounded, many of them critically. The victims were individuals from all walks of life, all of whom had come to enjoy a day of celebration, only to have their lives torn apart in an instant. Irina McCarthy, 35, and her husband, Kevin McCarthy, 37, were among the first victims. The couple had been attending the parade with their 2-year-old son, Aiden, who was miraculously uninjured. Tragically, Irina and Kevin were both killed in the attack, leaving their young son orphaned. Their loss was particularly heartbreaking, as Aiden now had to grow up without his parents, and the community was devastated by the senseless loss of 2 beloved individuals. Jackie Sundheim, 63, a beloved member of the North Shore Congregation Israel, was also killed. Jackie was a well-known figure in her community, described as warm, caring, and dedicated to helping others. Her death left a profound impact on the congregation and the many people whose lives she had touched. Stephen Strauss, 88, a retired doctor and another cherished member of the community, was another of the victims. Stephen's death marked the loss of a man who had spent his life helping others, only to have his own life tragically cut short in such a violent manner. Nicholas Toledo, 76, a visiting family member who had come to enjoy the parade, was also among those killed. He had been visiting relatives and was described as a warm, friendly man who had been excited to experience the parade. His death underscored the randomness of the attack and the fact that no one was safe that day. Irina's and Kevin's son, Aiden, was not only a survivor but a symbol of the innocent lives impacted by this tragedy. Aiden's resilience, despite being orphaned that day, became a source of strength for his extended family and the entire community. Additionally, 2 other victims were identified as Jacqueline Sundheim's son, and the family, including several other families, suffered extensive losses and injuries that would linger for years to come. Each of these victims had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and each family's world was irrevocably altered by the tragedy. The pain and anguish of the families left behind could not be understated, as they now had to face life without their loved ones. The details of the shooting reveal how well-prepared and methodical Crimo was in carrying out his plan. Armed with a high-powered rifle, Crimo fired at the crowd from the rooftop of a business building along the parade route. What made his attack particularly chilling was how he seemed to execute it with little emotion or haste. The shots were deliberate, precise, and coldly calculated. Crimo had a clear advantage. His elevated position gave him a perfect view of the unsuspecting crowd below, and his rifle allowed him to fire from a distance with devastating accuracy. By the time law enforcement had been alerted, the shooting had already occurred, and Crimo had already begun his escape. Crimo did not remain at the scene for long. After the shooting stopped, he fled the rooftop, blending into the crowd and disappearing into the streets of Highland Park. At that point, the authorities had no idea who the shooter was or where he might be. This added to the confusion and fear that had already engulfed the parade-goers. It wasn't until hours later that Crimo was apprehended. In the interim, the police scoured the area, investigating possible leads, while the community tried to process what had just happened. The manhunt that followed only deepened the sense of unease and urgency. Crimo was ultimately captured in the town of Lake Forest after being spotted in his vehicle. The suspect had remained calm and cooperative, but the chilling nature of his actions was not lost on the officers who apprehended him. In the wake of the shooting, Highland Park was gripped by fear and confusion. What had started as an ordinary morning, filled with excitement and celebration, had devolved into a chaotic and tragic scene. As the shooter fled into the crowd, the immediate response from law enforcement would set the tone for the next critical hours. The first officers arrived on the scene just moments after the gunfire erupted. The chaotic nature of the situation made it difficult to assess the full scale of the attack. Parade-goers were still scattering in all directions, desperately trying to escape the horror unfolding around them. Law enforcement immediately began securing the area, evacuating the injured, and setting up a perimeter. But finding the shooter was not easy. With little information about the assailant's identity or whereabouts, the police began their search methodically. Witnesses reported seeing a man with a rifle, but there were no clear leads on his location. The officers quickly realized that the key to solving this would lie in identifying the shooter as soon as possible, but time was of the essence. Authorities were also quick to request assistance from federal agencies, including the FBI. The full scale of the tragedy meant that the case would become a high priority, not just locally, but on a national level. The investigation immediately began to expand, as teams of detectives worked around the clock to piece together the evidence and determine how and why this attack had occurred. As the police began to gather information from eyewitnesses, they started compiling a description of the shooter, which would ultimately help lead to his identification. But it wasn't until hours later that they would uncover the key piece of evidence that would crack the case wide open. After the shooting, Crimo's escape was swift. He blended into the crowd, making his way to his vehicle, which had been parked several blocks away. He then drove off, taking a route that would ultimately lead to his capture, but not before law enforcement had launched a full-scale manhunt. The breakthrough in the case came when an officer, who was working on a tip-off, spotted a vehicle matching the description of the one Crimo was driving. After a tense and strategic pursuit, Crimo was pulled over in Lake Forest, a nearby town. At that point, law enforcement knew they had their suspect, but the situation was far from resolved. Crimo was arrested without incident. He was calm during his arrest, offering no resistance as officers took him into custody. His demeanor was unsettlingly neutral, with no apparent signs of distress or remorse. As he was led away in handcuffs, the realization set in: the person responsible for this devastating attack was, in fact, just a few miles away and under the watchful eye of the law. The investigation quickly turned to the contents of Crimo's vehicle and his residence, where more evidence was uncovered. Inside his car, law enforcement found the high-caliber rifle used in the shooting, along with a bag containing ammunition. It was clear that Crimo had come prepared, a chilling confirmation of the premeditated nature of the attack. The rifle, an AR-15 style weapon, had been legally purchased by Crimo earlier in the year. This fact would become a key point in discussions surrounding gun control and the accessibility of firearms in the wake of the shooting. Authorities also found a second rifle at Crimo's home, along with additional ammunition, suggesting that he had fully planned the attack and was ready to continue the violence if he had been able to carry out further plans. In the days following his arrest, Crimo's behavior revealed more about his intentions. In his initial interrogation, Crimo was eerily calm. He confessed to the shooting without hesitation, explaining that he had carefully planned the attack for months. He admitted that he had watched other mass shootings for inspiration, and his motivation seemed rooted in a desire for notoriety and attention. He spoke of a vague, nihilistic belief that he was meant to carry out this act, an idea that seemed to fuel his decision to open fire on innocent people. Further investigation into his online activity revealed more disturbing details. Crimo's social media accounts, which had been a source of concern for months prior to the shooting, contained videos and images that hinted at his violent intentions. In one particularly unsettling video, Crimo could be seen wearing a black mask and describing his plans in a cryptic, almost ritualistic way. These videos painted a picture of a young man who had become increasingly detached from reality, fixated on carrying out a mass murder for reasons that seemed both delusional and terrifying. In addition to his social media presence, Crimo's personal writings and online journals were found to contain references to violence and a desire for recognition. It became clear that his actions had been carefully calculated, with no signs of spontaneous impulse. His meticulous planning and the calm manner in which he carried out the attack suggested a chilling level of detachment from the consequences of his actions. After Robert Crimo III was arrested and charged with the brutal shooting that took the lives of 7 people and left dozens more wounded, the wheels of justice began to turn. But what followed in the courtroom was an intense and emotional journey, one that would see the community, the victims' families, and the survivors forced to confront the terrible aftermath of his actions. Crimo's legal proceedings began soon after his arrest. The charges against him were severe: 7 counts of first-degree murder, dozens of counts of attempted murder, and numerous other charges related to the shooting. Given the nature of the crime, prosecutors made it clear that they would seek justice to the fullest extent of the law. The case drew significant attention, with people across the nation eager to see how the legal system would handle a case so deeply rooted in senseless violence. In the weeks that followed his arrest, Crimo's legal team deliberated on his defense. What was clear from the outset, however, was that Crimo had planned the attack meticulously. There was little question about his involvement, and the only real question seemed to be the degree of his responsibility and his mental state at the time of the shooting. While Crimo's defense attorneys sought to explore the possibility of a mental health defense, Crimo himself made a decision that shocked many: he chose to plead guilty to all charges. This decision was a break from what some expected, as many had anticipated a drawn-out trial with debates over his mental capacity. Instead, Crimo entered a guilty plea, acknowledging his role in the deaths and the devastation he caused. In doing so, he accepted responsibility for his actions, though the reasons behind them remained complicated and unclear. By pleading guilty, Crimo avoided the potential of a death penalty trial, as Illinois had abolished the death penalty years earlier. Still, the plea did not diminish the gravity of the crime or the emotional toll it took on the victims' families and the entire community. The trial, while marked by Crimo's guilty plea, was far from over in terms of the emotional weight it carried. The families of the victims, as well as the survivors of the shooting, were given the opportunity to speak during the trial. These victim impact statements became a powerful and emotional part of the proceedings, allowing those affected by the attack to express the profound grief, anger, and sorrow they had carried since that fateful day. One by one, the families and survivors took the stand, their voices filled with pain as they described the lasting impact of the attack. The parents of the victims shared their sorrow over the children they had lost, while siblings and extended family members struggled to come to terms with the brutality of what had occurred. Irina and Kevin McCarthy's family spoke of their profound loss. Irina and Kevin had been the beloved parents of young Aidan McCarthy, who was only 2 years old when his life was shattered. Aidan, who had witnessed the death of both of his parents, was left to grow up without the love and care of his mother and father. The McCarthy family shared their heartbreak over Aidan's future, one that would now be forever altered by the tragic loss of both of his parents. Jackie Sundheim's family described her as a pillar of the community, someone who had dedicated her life to helping others, whether through her work at the North Shore Congregation Israel or her volunteer efforts. Jackie's family spoke of the gaping hole her death had left in their lives, and how the community was forever changed by the loss of such a kind and generous soul. The family of Nicholas Toledo, a visiting family member who had been enjoying the parade with his relatives, spoke of the man who had been known for his warmth and love of life. His death, they explained, was a senseless loss that no one could ever truly comprehend. They recalled how he had looked forward to the parade, only to have that joy ripped away by Crimo's violent actions. Stephen Strauss's family also addressed the court, describing the pain of losing a man who had spent his life helping others. Stephen had been an esteemed doctor and a respected figure in his community, and his family's words conveyed the deep sadness and anger over how his life had been stolen away in such a brutal way. These emotional statements were difficult to listen to, but they painted a clear picture of the deep and lasting wounds that Crimo's actions had inflicted on the families and the community. These voices, full of grief, love, and loss, were the human faces behind the headlines and legal proceedings, reminding everyone that real lives had been shattered by this horrific event. Finally, the day arrived when Robert Crimo III would face the consequences of his actions. Despite his guilty plea, the courtroom was filled with an air of anticipation, as the victims' families hoped to hear from the judge. The emotional statements and the weight of the evidence made it clear that this was not a case that would be easily forgotten. On March 2023, Robert Crimo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, having listened to the victim impact statements and considered the gravity of the crime, handed down the harshest sentence available, reflecting the sheer devastation caused by Crimo's actions. Crimo's calm and unemotional demeanor in the courtroom stood in stark contrast to the anguish of the families, making the sentence all the more poignant. In his sentencing remarks, the judge spoke of the deep sorrow and loss that had been caused by Crimo's actions. He acknowledged the lasting impact on the victims' families, as well as the community of Highland Park, which would never be the same again. Crimo's life, once filled with potential, would now be defined by the violence he had wrought. The victims' families could take some measure of solace in the fact that he would never be free again, but the emotional scars left by the attack would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The sentencing marked the end of Crimo's legal journey, but it was far from the end of the healing process for those who had been touched by his violence. For the families of the victims and the survivors, there was no true sense of closure. The emotional and psychological toll of the attack would linger long after the legal proceedings had concluded. In the aftermath of the Highland Park shooting, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the immediate victims and their families. What had once been a peaceful suburban town was now forever marked by tragedy. The psychological and emotional toll on the community was immense, and the days and weeks that followed the attack saw residents and survivors grappling with how to process such a senseless and violent event. In the wake of the tragedy, Highland Park was forced to come to terms with what had happened, and the community's response was nothing short of remarkable. In the days following the attack, a sense of unity began to take shape. People who had once been strangers to each other found themselves bonding over shared grief and loss. Highland Park, though shaken, began to heal through acts of solidarity, remembrance, and defiance against the terror that had been thrust upon it. One of the first steps toward healing was the creation of memorials. The streets where the parade had taken place, now eerily silent, were transformed into places of remembrance. Makeshift memorials sprang up across town, filled with flowers, candles, and messages of love for the victims. Many of these memorials were centered around the families who had lost loved ones, with neighbors and strangers alike coming together to express their condolences. People would stop by to leave handwritten notes, share stories of the victims, and offer support to those whose lives had been upended. Survivors of the attack also began to find ways to cope with the trauma. Some chose to speak publicly about their experiences, sharing their stories with the world to give voice to those who had been affected. Others joined support groups, where they could find solace in the shared experiences of other survivors. The trauma of witnessing such horror, of running for their lives and trying to protect loved ones, was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Yet in many cases, the resilience of the community was evident as people began to rebuild their sense of normalcy, even in the face of unimaginable pain. As time passed, the town began holding memorial services and vigils, allowing the residents to honor the victims and survivors in their own way. These events became vital spaces for the community to mourn, reflect, and eventually heal. The Highland Park community proved that, while the attack had changed them forever, it would not break their spirit. The shooting also sparked larger conversations on the national stage, especially regarding issues such as gun control and mental health. The ease with which Robert Crimo had obtained his weapons, including the AR-15 style rifle he used in the attack, reignited debates about gun laws and the accessibility of high-powered firearms. In Illinois, where the shooting took place, there were already laws in place that required background checks and waiting periods for firearm purchases. However, Crimo was able to legally purchase his weapons despite multiple red flags. He had a history of troubling behavior, including disturbing social media posts, but there was no system in place to prevent him from obtaining firearms. This reality led many to question whether existing laws were sufficient or if additional regulations were needed to prevent future tragedies. Advocacy groups, particularly those focused on gun violence prevention, rallied for stricter gun control measures. They argued that Crimo's ability to legally purchase firearms was a failure of the system, and they called for a re-evaluation of current policies to ensure that individuals with histories of violence or mental health issues could not access weapons so easily. Calls for stronger background checks, red flag laws, and bans on assault-style weapons became central to the national discourse in the aftermath of the Highland Park shooting. At the same time, the attack underscored the critical need for better mental health resources, particularly for young people who may be struggling with feelings of isolation, anger, or disillusionment. Crimo's social media presence, which had been filled with troubling and violent rhetoric, raised concerns about the role that mental health plays in violent crime. Many experts argued that addressing mental health before it escalates into violence is crucial in preventing tragedies like the one in Highland Park. Crimo's own behavior prior to the shooting, including disturbing online videos and messages, demonstrated that there were clear signs of distress and violence that could have been addressed with the right support systems. Yet, in his case, these red flags went largely unnoticed or ignored. The broader discussion centered on the importance of early intervention, better mental health care access, and the need to identify at-risk individuals before they turn violent. The shooting also prompted calls for broader public safety reforms. Advocates for both gun control and mental health initiatives emphasized that without a combined approach, it would be nearly impossible to prevent future tragedies. They argued that a multifaceted solution was needed, one that included not just stronger gun laws but also a better support system for individuals struggling with mental health issues. For Highland Park itself, the aftermath of the shooting would be long-lasting. While the town slowly began to recover, the emotional scars were deeply felt. Community events that had once been full of joy now felt tinged with grief. The 4th of July parade, which had been a symbol of the community's spirit, would forever be linked to the horrific events of that day. However, in the years to come, Highland Park worked to honor the victims and survivors by fostering a culture of remembrance and resilience. The local government, alongside advocacy organizations, began working on ways to make the community safer, focusing on both mental health resources and measures to prevent gun violence. The Highland Park shooting, though a tragedy, became a catalyst for change. It reignited discussions across the nation about the urgent need to confront both gun violence and mental health issues head-on, with many hoping that future generations wouldn't have to face the same heartbreak. As the trial of Robert Crimo III came to an end and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the final chapter in this tragic story was written. The senseless violence that unfolded on the 4th of July, 2022, left 7 families forever broken and an entire community grappling with the aftermath. Crimo's guilty plea acknowledged his role in the killings, but no sentence could truly bring back the lives that were lost, nor could it heal the deep wounds inflicted on the survivors. This case stands as a chilling reminder of the consequences of unchecked violence and the failure to address the underlying issues that lead to these horrific acts. While Crimo's life will now be spent in prison, the scars on the Highland Park community will last much longer. The emotional toll of this attack, felt not only by the victims and their families but by the survivors and the town as a whole, is a burden that can never be fully erased. The case of Robert Crimo III raises broader societal questions that continue to haunt us. What role should mental health screenings play in gun ownership? How do we address the disturbing trends of violence that are increasingly seen in mass shootings across the nation? These questions are more pressing now than ever. As a society, we must come to terms with the reality that tragedies like this may become more frequent unless we actively address the issues at their core: mental health, gun accessibility, and the safety of our communities. While justice was served in the courtroom with Crimo's conviction and life sentence, true justice for the victims means creating an environment where such tragedies can be prevented. It's not enough to simply punish the perpetrator. We must also work to dismantle the conditions that allow these events to happen in the first place. The sentencing, while providing some sense of closure, does little to erase the lasting grief or to heal the deep wounds inflicted on the families, survivors, and community members who will carry this tragedy with them for the rest of their lives. As we reflect on this case, it is important to consider the larger issues at stake. What can we do to prevent future tragedies? How can we ensure that communities are safe, that people struggling with mental health have access to the care they need, and that firearms are kept out of the hands of those who pose a danger to themselves or others? This is not just a story of one man's actions, but a larger societal issue that demands our attention. The conversation sparked by the Highland Park shooting, about gun control, mental health, and public safety, need to continue. It's up to all of us to push for meaningful change, whether through advocacy, supporting mental health services, or working together to make our communities safer for everyone. Take a moment to reflect on the lives affected by this tragedy. Consider what steps we can all take to ensure that future generations do not have to endure the same kind of pain. The time for change is now.